Okay, so I'm going to read Past the Shallows and put it on YouTube to help out with Year 11, and this is the first chapter. Okay, Past the Shallows, chapter 1, well, the first 20 pages anyway. Alright, Past the Shallows. It would be vain of me to attempt to describe my feelings when I behold this lonely harbour lying in the world's end, separated as it were from the rest of the universe. 'Twas nature, and nature in her wildest mood. Admiral D, 1972. Out past the shallows, past the sandy bottom bays, comes the dark water, black and cold and roaring, rolling out the invisible paths, the ancient paths to Broody, or down south along the silent cliffs, the paths out deep to the bird islands that stand tall between nothing but water and sky. Wherever rock comes out of deep water, wherever reef rises up, there is abalone, black-lipped, soft bodies protected by shell. Treasure. Harry stood on the sand and looked down at the wide, curved beach of Cloudy Bay. Everything was clean and golden and crisp, the sky almost violet with the winter light. He wished that he wasn't afraid. They were leaving him again, his brothers Miles already half in his wetsuit and Joe standing tall, eyes lost to the water. Water that was always there, always everywhere, the sound and the smell and the cold waves making Harry different. And it wasn't just because he was the youngest. He knew the way he felt about the ocean would never leave him now. It would be there always, right inside him. That was just how it was. What should I find? He asked. Joe shook his dry wetsuit out hard. A cuttlefish bone, a nice bit of driftwood, a shark egg, Miles said. And there was silence. Harry waited for Miles to say he was joking, waited for him to say something, but he didn't. He just kept waxing his board, so Harry stood up and ran. He followed the marks of high tide left behind on the sand, and his eyes skimmed the pebbles. The shiny jelly sacks, the broken shells. Cuttlefish were easy, but shark eggs were impossible. They looked just like seaweed. He kept thinking he'd found one only to realise it was just a bit of kelp or a grimy pebble. There was hardly any point trying, but he did try. He always found everything on the list, always. There was a cormorant gliding low, its soft white stomach almost touching the water, and Harry watched it as it moved. He watched it slow down and land on a rock on the shore. He walked close, walked right up to the rock, but the bird didn't move. It just stayed still, and he'd never seen one alone. Not like this, on the land. They were always in groups, cormorants, huddled together in groups on cliffs and rocks, long necks reaching up to the sun. Sometimes they stayed like that all day, together, waiting and watching and resting. The bird called softly, and Harry was so close that he felt the sound vibrate inside him. He wanted to reach out and touch it, to stroke the silky, shimmering feathers down the cormorant's back, but he stayed, still, kept his arms by his sides. He thought that maybe the cormorant was sick, that maybe it couldn't find the others, and he didn't know how they made it and how they survived. Flying over all that ocean, flying and flying in the wind and in the rain, diving into the cold water. They washed up in the surf sometimes, the lost ones. The bird called again. It bobbed its head up and down and spread its wings. Then it was gone. Harry left the beach and ventured into the dunes. Might find a good bit of driftwood in there, or something interesting at least. He ran up and down the small humps and valleys, the loose sand getting firmer under his feet, and he kept on going. He could hardly see the beach anymore. It was further than he had ever been. He slowed down, started walking, and he looked ahead. There was some kind of clearing, small trees all around, shrubs. It was a good-looking sheltered place. The wind wouldn't get in this far, even if it was really blowing. You could camp here, you could stay here, and it would be all right. Behind a shrub, a pile of shells, a giant pile, old and brittle and white from the sun. Oyster and mussels and pippy and clam, the armour of a giant crab. Harry picked up an abalone shell, the edges loose and dusty in his hands, and every cell in his body stopped. Felt it, this place, felt the people who had been here before, breathing and standing alive where he stood. People who were long dead now, long gone, and Harry understood, right down to his guts, that the time ran on further, ever, and one day he would die. The skin on his hands tingled and pricked. He dropped the shell and ran. He had to wait for ages, but finally Joe came in. Miles stayed out. He was way out deep and it didn't even look like there were any waves out there. He was just sitting in the water, just sitting there, and Harry was starving. Couldn't stop thinking about those sandwiches, the cheese and the chutney ones. I didn't find it, the shark egg. Joe was struggling with his wetsuit, getting his arms free, and he was twisting and panting and not looking at Harry. Maybe next time, he said, but Harry didn't think it was likely. When Joe was finally back in his clothes, he started unpacking the stuff from the dinghy. The thermos and the tin cups and the rug and the sandwiches. As long as they didn't have to wait for Miles. No, Harry wouldn't be able to wait for Miles, even if Joe said he had to, because Miles could stay out in the water forever, even if it was freezing, and Harry just had to have one of the sandwiches now. This place is old, he says, his mouth full of bread. Joe made a sound, but he wasn't really listening. He was somewhere else, maybe still out there in the water with Miles, but it didn't matter. This place was old, and Harry knew it. As old as the world. Miles got in the dinghy with the men, with Martin and Jeff and Dad, and he didn't speak. No one spoke on the way out to the boat. He hadn't been able to eat his toast at home in the early darkness, and now just on dawn he wished he had. His stomach was empty this first day. The first day of the school holidays, the first day he must man the boat alone while the men go down. Old enough now, he must take his place, just like his brother before him. He must fill the gap Uncle Nick left, because the bank owed the boat now, because the bank owned everything. The boat chugged and rattled its way through the heads, and Miles felt the channel grab hold. Pull on her hard. She was weak, the lady eyed her. She seemed old now, and the crossing was slow. She ploughed through the deepest part of the channel, leaving a wide wake of ridges behind, and Miles knew this was where it would have happened, where Uncle Nick would have been dragged out alone in the dark, where the rip ran strongest, and they never found him, not one bit, not his beanie, not his boots, not his bones, just the dinghy floating loose and empty and washed clean. Nobody talked about it now, but back then Dad talked about it. He said Uncle Nick must have gone out to check the mooring. He said he'd never forgive himself. The boat was almost new, anchored out at the mouth of the bay because the swell was right up. A big winter swell, and all the boats were out there, but Nick wouldn't leave it alone. He wouldn't stop worrying about the boat. Dad said he went on and on about it at the pub, and in the end Dad told him to go and check the damn thing, to go and check it, or just shut up about it. And Miles knew exactly how dark it was that night, the sky blacked out by clouds so thick that nothing came through, no stars or moon or anything. Uncle Nick wouldn't have been able to see the dinghy or the land or even his own hand in front of his face. And everyone forgot about him out there because that was the night of the crash. That was the night when everything changed. Martin touched his shoulder and stood close. "It'll be all right," he said. Dad and Jeff were in the cabin, and Jeff was staring at him again, so Miles looked away. He slipped his yellow wind cheater over his jumper. Dad didn't have any small enough for him, so he had to wear a man's size, and it was baggy, hung way down past his hands. It was almost better not to wear one at all. He'd get soaked anyway. The only part of him that would stay warm was his head under a tight wool beanie that made his scalp itch. He rolled up the sleeves and he pulled on his gloves. Bruni was coming clear in the new light. Miles watched the surface change colour, come to life, and even though they were still out deep, away from land, there were places where the water rose like it was climbing a hill, places where the water was angry, and it wasn't the back of a wave, it wasn't a peak in the swell, it wasn't the current surging into the rocks that hid below, rocks that you couldn't even see when the tide was low, and if you didn't know what the rise in the water meant, you would never guess those rocks were there. The hazards. They were called the hazards of Bruni. They were all around here, out deep, rocks that weren't attached to land but were big enough on their own to disturb the water, to change its path, and maybe they had been islands once. Those rocks, small islands, or maybe even bigger ones before they got worn away, worn by the water and by the wind and the rain until they were gone from sight, and only the foundations remain, hidden and lost under the sea. There were things that no one could teach you, things about the water. You just knew them or you didn't, and no one could tell you how to read it or how to feel it. Miles knew the water, he could feel it, and he knew not to trust it. The air was cold and the house was quiet. Harry got out of bed and shoved his bare feet into sneakers. Out in the kitchen, if he stood right on the tips of his sneakers, he could just reach the peanut butter jar up in the top cupboard. He ran his fingers around the inside of the almost empty jar. There was only enough peanut butter for one slice, so he put 2 pieces of bread in the toaster and made a toast sandwich. Even though the embers were dead, Harry sat down by the wood heater to eat. He ate quickly. Auntie Jean would be here soon to take him to the regatta, and he'd better get dressed properly. He'd better find the scarf she'd made him and wear it. He'd better put on the navy blue parka she'd bought him for Christmas. He didn't really like the parka because it was too big and he didn't like the colour, but it was warm. Anyway, he didn't have another coat, only a thin rain jacket. He wished Jo would take him to the show instead of Auntie Jean, but at least she didn't talk much in the car. She had the radio on, but it was mostly a man talking and not enough songs. Harry tried to listen to the talking so he didn't have to think about the road. It was a long drive, and the worst bit was still to come, the bit where the thin little road curved round and round as it climbed up the back of Mount Wellington. That was where his ears usually popped and where he usually got car sick. He tried hard not to get car sick. Auntie Jean might turn back and take him home if he got sick. He kept his eyes on things inside the car. He looked at the dash and down at his legs. He looked at the back of the black mat that his feet rested on, and he looked at Auntie Jean's white lumpy hands wrapped tight around the steering wheel. Finally they were at Fern Tree. Harry opened and closed his drawer a few times to help his ears clear. He thought about asking Auntie Jean to stop so he could go to the toilet, but he decided to hold on. They were finally on the other side going down, and he could look out the window and see Hobart in slivers through the trees that lined the road. Parts of the houses and bits of roads, flash of blue water and white sails, and as the trees thinned out there were more and more houses. The city finally came into view as a whole, and Harry loved it. All the buildings and the cars and all the things to do. Auntie Jean parked the car on the grass near the cenotaph. She wanted to see the wood chopping and it started at 11. That meant they had 40 minutes, so after finding the portable loos, Harry led them straight to the rides. He wanted to take his time, look at them all, because he knew he would only be allowed to go on one. Some of the rides looked scary and some were boring, like the merry-go-round. The Gee-Whizzer looked the best, but he needed Miles here to go on it with him. If he went by himself, he would slide along the seat every time the ride spun in a new direction. There was no way he'd get Auntie Jean to go on the Gee-Whizzer. Maybe she'd go on the Ferris wheel. As they walked around, Harry noticed all the game stalls, moving clown faces, darts, hoops, and one he didn't know. There were lots of jars arranged on a table, and some had money in them, notes. The jar in the middle had $10 note in it. You had to throw a 1-cent piece into the jar containing a note, and if you did, you won the money. Maybe I could have a go at that, he said. Auntie Jean looked over at the stall. Nobody ever wins those games, Harry. They're set up so that no one wins. If you spend the money I give you there, you won't be able to go on a ride. Harry looked over at the Gee-Whizzer one more time. Kids were screaming their heads off as the carriages twirled. I don't think I want to go on a ride, he said. Well, don't be disappointed when you don't win anything. Harry took the $1 note from her hand and ran over to the stall. A hairy, red-eyed man gave him 3 1-cent pieces to throw at the jars. He threw the first way too far and it missed the table altogether and landed on the grass. Harry thought that maybe it didn't count and he could start again, but the man shook his head. It counted. He threw the second and it hit the rim of an empty jar and fell onto the table. Harry threw the last coin more carefully and it worked. The coin bounced off the rim of one jar and landed in another that had a $5 note in it. I won, Auntie Jean, I won. No, you didn't. It doesn't count. The bearded man pointed to a large sign that had a lot of black writing on it. The coin must go straight in. It can't bounce off another jar first. Auntie Jean was suddenly right beside him. Come away, Harry. I told you it was a waste of money. Harry felt his face getting hot. People were looking over and he kept his eyes down as he walked away from the stall. Auntie Jean kept on talking, going on about how he'd wasted his money, and Harry stopped listening. He studied people's feet as they walked. He looked at all the shoes that passed by. There were a lot of gumboots, lots of gumboots. There were lots of strollers and prams, and even though it was only the first day of the regatta, the grass had already been worn away where people walked. Dark, sticky earth was covered in wrappers and plastic bags and squashed hot chip buckets. Then Harry saw it. $20. It was just lying there and a woman trod right on it, and she didn't notice it. She just kept on walking. Harry dropped down and grabbed it. It was crumpled and muddy, but it really was $20. It really was. Auntie Jean stopped walking. She looked down. Don't sulk, Harry. It doesn't suit you. Harry held the note up. Look! Auntie Jean huddled over him. Get up and put it in your pocket before someone says they dropped it. Harry stood up and shoved the note in his pocket, and he kept his hand on it so it wouldn't fall out. It was his now. He wasn't going to lose it. It's a lot of money, Harry. A lot of money. You can buy your own show bags now, okay? But don't spend it all. You should save it. Save it, she said. But Harry was way ahead of her. Now he could get 2 show bags, and one for Miles, and go on a ride, and maybe get a show bag for his friend Stuart, because Stuart's never got to come to the show. And when Ben at school busted Harry's He-Man's head off, Stuart let him play with his He-Man. Stuart's had He-Man and Battle Cat and Beastman and Skeletor. Harry should probably buy him a He-Man show bag. Auntie Jean was looking at a watch. Harry knew her legs would be hurting by now and that she wanted to get off to the wood chopping, but he didn't care. He had $20. He could get whatever he wanted, and Auntie Jean couldn't say anything about it. He could get 10 show bags if he wanted. 10! We'd better go and get a seat. Brian Roberts' boy is competing. Heath. Is that his name? Harry nodded. Inside the marquee, they sat on plastic seats near the front. It was crowded, and the competitors in their white t-shirts were already standing on the centre stage of grass, checking their equipment. Harry recognised Heath Roberts. He was the skinniest man up there, but he had the most hair. Thick blonde hair, just like his brother Justin. Justin had been in Miles's year at school. The first 4 men took their positions on top of the huge logs. The starter gun fired, and 4 sharp metal axes swung through the air. Wood chips were flying, and the metal swung and swung. It was making Harry hot. All the movement and noise, all the metal slicing into wood, and it wouldn't stop. The hack, 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 and the crowd were grunting and yelling, and a man next to him kept screaming, "Come on, boy, come on!" Harry tugged on Auntie Jean's coat sleeve. "What is it?" she said, but she didn't move her eyes. They stayed with the axes, stayed fixed on the men. Harry tugged harder. "I feel sick," he said. "Damn, Heath's out." The metal noise stopped, and the crowd clapped and cheered. Harry looked over, and a big bald man with a sweaty head had busted through his log. It lay on the grass in 2 pointy pieces. "I feel sick," Harry said again. Auntie Jean looked at him. "Yes, you do look pale. Go and get some fresh air, and come and get me if you need me. I want to see the final." She turned her attention back to the action, and Harry pushed his way through to the exit before the next heat started. Out in the light, away from the noise and the crowd, he started to feel better. He could breathe again. He could think about the show bags. Cadbury bags were the best. They had the most chocolate, but they were pricey. $4. He bought one for Miles and one for himself, and he looked at the He-Man bag. It was okay, with a face mask, colouring book and plastic belt, but he decided it was probably better to get Stuart a lolly bag. He got a Redskins bag because it had stacks of Redskins, choo-choos, toffee apples. He got one for himself too, and a Birdie Beetle bag because it was cheap and came with a cowboy hat and an orange dart gun. Then he bought 2 hot American donuts and a can of lemonade. He had $4.50 left. He sat down on a patch of grass that overlooked the water. The Tasman Bridge was a giant concrete frame, and underneath it the regatta was all going on. Rowing races, sailboats, larger ferries patrolling up and down with large colourful flags. Harry ate the donuts and felt good. Miles would love the Cadbury's bag. He could give him a Redskin or a toffee apple too if he wanted. He saw one of the animal sheds and decided to go in. He wanted to make sure the chopping was over before he went back to Auntie Jean. Inside it was warm and smelled like manure. A huge bull gave him the evil eye as he scooted by, and Harry didn't care what people said about cows being dumb. He knew they were smart by the way they looked at you. They were just waiting to get you as soon as you turned your back. In the next aisle there were goats, white ones, brown ones, and a strange-looking black and tan one with big ears. There were 4 babies with it, and above the pen was a blue ribbon that said "Best in the Show, 1983. Harry squatted down and stuck his hand through the bars. One of the babies ran over and tried to bite his thumb. It didn't seem to have any teeth, so it didn't hurt. After a few bites, it gave up and started rubbing the top of its head against Harry's arm. They're real beauties, aren't they? Harry shot up and a tall man wearing overalls was standing right behind him. "I'm sorry," Harry said. The baby goat bleated and it looked up to see where its scratching post had gone. "You're all right, son," the man said, and he had a lined, smiling face. He bent down and picked the little goat up. "Here, you can hold it if you like. It's an African goat. It's called an Anglo-Nubian." Harry looked at the goat and it started chewing the man's overalls. He wanted to hold it. He wanted to climb in the pen and sit down and play with all the goats, like the time with Mum, when they had come to the show and they had all sat down in the straw and the little goat came up and licked Harry's face, and its tongue was hard and rough, but its breath was warm on his cheek, and it let out a little bleat right in Harry's ear. Harry bleated back and it had made Mum laugh. "I love goats," she said. "My aunt's waiting," Harry said. The man nodded and he smiled and he put the little goat back in the pen with the others, and Harry ran out of the shed holding his show bags tight as he wove his way through families and packs of screaming teenage girls. "Looks like somebody did well," Auntie Jean said, looking down at the show bags Harry carried in both hands. "They're not all for me. Well, just don't eat too many lollies now. We'll have a bit more of a look around and then we'll go into town for lunch. They only seem to have Dagwood dogs and chips here." Harry decided not to tell Auntie Jean about the donuts and lemonade. And that's where we'll stop today. We're up to page 23.